go there.
Welcome to the October 10th regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission, City of Post Falls. Will you please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Welcome again, everyone in the crowd. Remind to silence your cell phones. Roll call.
Alrighty. Hampe? Here. Davis?
Here.
Kimball?
Present.
Carey?
Here.
Keene?
Here. All right. Mr. Manley, any adjustments, amendments to the agenda this evening?
None.
Any ceremonies, appointments, announcements, and/or presentations?
No, there's not.
Okay. That being said, any declaration of conflict this evening? No. Or conflict, either way. Okay. Consent calendar. You will see that 4 things on consent calendar. Number 1, minutes from the September 12th, 2017 Planning and Zoning meeting. You'll also find the findings from the Pointe Comprehensive Plan Amendment file number CPA-17-01, followed by the findings for the Pointe Zone Change file number ZC-17-04, and finally, on the consent calendar, the findings from the Meadow Grove Preliminary PUD and Subdivision file number P-1703/S-1709. On consent calendar.
I move to approve as presented.
I second.
It's been moved and seconded. Call for a vote.
Keene?
Yes.
Carey?
Yes.
Kimball?
Yes.
Davis?
Yes.
Hampe?
Yes.
So moved. Brings us to item number 8 this evening, citizen issues. This section is reserved for citizens wishing to address the commission on issues that are not on the agenda. Comments for issues in future planning and zoning meetings. We'd ask that you would hold until then any public comment this evening. Okay. Then that brings us to unfinished business. No unfinished or old business?
None.
None. So that brings us to public hearing. We have PUD Ordinance Text Amendment File TA-17-01. So we'll go ahead and open that public hearing.
So while John's bringing that up, we're going to kind of tag team this a little bit tonight. John's struggling with trying to not lose his voice, so he's going to run a PowerPoint and I'm going to talk, and we'll both try to answer any questions you have as we go through it. As a bit of setting a bit of the background, we've been working on amendments to our PUD code for probably 18 months now. During this process, staff has gone over the code in detail, compared it with what's happening in other jurisdictions. We've sent this out to area developers and received their comments back, incorporated some of those. We've had a workshop with council at this point, and now we're here starting the public hearing process. Tonight, our intention is to go over the substantive changes, and then next month come back and discuss with you some of the procedural changes that we're looking to make in the code. So that's kind of where we're at. There's some other things that we have in the queue, give you a sense of some other things that we're working on. John has been diligently working with our consultants on a comprehensive plan update as well as a comprehensive overhaul of our zoning code. We're hoping that sort of all of these things start merging back together next year. What we're doing with the PUD code will slot into that. We're currently also beginning the process of a subdivision code update that would incorporate much of what we're seeing in our zoning code update as well. So that's probably late 2018 before you see that. Also, we currently have another consultant working on updating our wireless code, meaning our cell tower code. That industry is changing rapidly. The technology is going to small cells. Typically, you'll see a smaller tower that's attached to a light pole, and lots of those rather than large towers that are spread throughout a community. It's time for us to update our code. We're probably looking at dealing with that first part of the year. Actually just got Friday the most recent revised draft back, and have yet to dig into it. So we've got a number of things that we're working on code-wise that will hopefully come to fruition in the near future. Some of our goals as we dug into the PUD process, we kicked around, do we even want to retain the PUD process? Do we want, what is it that we want to accomplish? And one of our guiding thoughts was, let's be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Let's take a tool that works fairly well for our community. Let's evolve that, hopefully get a better product at the end of the day. And rather than sort of ripping it up and starting from scratch, we wanted to make sure that we were clear on our requirements. We wanted to make sure it was nice, clean drafting. Certainty is an important thing for us. People buy into a community, they want to know what they're getting. Same with developers. They want to know what's happening next door to them. They want to have some certainty in what the zoning requirements are. And finally, we wanted to make the process as quick as possible, not only to save staff time and developer time, but also, I don't think it does anybody any good to have multiple public hearings and bring citizens out on multiple evenings when you don't have to. So one of the things that I heard early on when I started this work was make the right thing the easy thing. So if you find what you want to have happen, make that process to get where you want people to go as easy as possible. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with these changes. So with that, we'll dive into some of the changes. At any point you want to stop and ask detailed questions. This is going to be sort of an overview of what we've changed. Happy to entertain substantive questions, dive into the actual text as we go through. One thing that we've noticed in our existing code was some deficiencies in how we deal with open space. One, we didn't have a really good definition of what open space is for a PUD. We also weren't really clear on what you could exclude and include in open space. There was a proposal probably 4 months ago where much of the open space was eaten up with parking, for instance. And so we've tried to clarify some of that. We've taken, you can go to the next slide, John. So we've excluded those types of things from the definition of open space. So your standard issue street side swale, that's not going to count as open space. Parking, not going to be included in open space. Unless, let me take that back, there's an exception to that if the parking is essentially to service the open space. So in other words, you're building a park and you have to have parking to service the park, that's going to be included in the definition. Otherwise, parking is not part of open space. Utility requirements, easements, those types of things, not included in open space. So we're getting a better, hopefully workable definition of what you can put in open space, what you can't. We would make allowance for sort of a multi-use facility. So if you have a large area that's going to work as stormwater infiltration, but it still functions for its recreational purpose, that would be allowed. But it can't, the stormwater use couldn't impair its use as recreation. So that would essentially, the street side swells, that's never going to count. But if you have a larger area that's overflow stormwater storage that doesn't impair the recreation, then it's okay. Another area wanted to make sure that people knew what the open space was. And so having some standards that essentially say you need to mark that open space in some fashion so people know what's open space, what they have access to, and then what they don't, obviously.
Warren?
Yeah.
John, could you go back a slide? With regards to the utility purposes, would that then prohibit like a sewer easement or a water easement going through that?
I don't see that. I think the bigger issue is more the sort of the corridor. If you're at sort of the sidewalk utility easements along a street, those types of things where somebody might want to put a buffer or the sidewalk easement in their open space. If it's running cross country through something, again, it's sort of getting back to that, is it impairing the recreational uses? I think what we're trying to avoid is the people who are trying to double dip. They have something that they have to dedicate for public use for a sidewalk or for a swale, a required buffer yard, and then they want to turn around and also get credit for that for the open space. We don't think that that's appropriate, but I think running a utility corridor cross country through an open space area, as long as it's not impairing that open space, to me that's a different creature.
Would we then add text to that effect where it would not, so as to not impair the use as open space? That way it's a little more, we understand or everyone understands.
So I'm making a note of that. We'll go back and look at that.
Okay.
That's part of what we're doing tonight is trying to suss out some of those things. we can't catch everything with code, and you need to leave enough flexibility to deal with some things. But
Yeah.
we'll take a look at that language and think about that with specifically. All right. Other areas with open space that we've dealt with is the developer, frankly, has some freedom in how they design their development. Oftentimes, you'll see one large piece of open space that's central in the development. Other times, you might see some more spread out, smaller open space areas. One thing we would want to ask the developer to do as they're preparing these things is take a look at the open space that's around you and try to coordinate to the extent that you can so that you're getting different amenities. So it's becoming a larger open space network rather than a sort of a standalone project. That would be true both inside their development. If you're going to have a larger development and you're going to spread your open space, don't repeat the same amenities over and over again, but also look exterior to your boundaries and try to provide something new that isn't available already in the neighborhood. When it comes to maintenance and dedication, we currently require that if it's private, it has to be maintained by an HOA. That continues. What we've added is that if it's going to be owned by the public, that needs to be dedicated with the first block of development. So their first phase of their subdivision, they would dedicate the public property to the city. It would then go into the city's process to develop that property, go through the designing the park, determining what types of amenities they want to put into it. And essentially the Parks Department would run that process through the Parks and Rec Committee to develop what that park looks like and how it functions. Sort of a corollary to that is we do have a requirement that each phase of development should be able to stand on its own. We didn't individually say that you have to put X percentage of your open space in each phase because we want to allow for people to have those larger open space blocks. But with that requirement that each can stand on its own, it creates the opportunity for us to review each application and say, this is an area where we should have a condition that says by the time you get to phase 6, you ought to be doing something with your open space. We thought about trying to come up with some proportion, but given that you just don't know what any given development's going to look like, it's really hard to say you need to give us X at each phase or without creating some additional complications. So we did think about that, and I think we can address that via condition as we look at individual development projects, so that we're trying to make sure that we don't get the open space being phase 10 of 10 projects and then have the risk of someone walking away from a development and leaving it undeveloped if it's going to be private. And frankly, if it's big, it's going to come in anyways because they want the city to maintain it.
Right.
I've seen, so with regards to the dedication of the public park, those usually only happen with like big greenfield developments, like the North Place or the big 300 acres north of Fieldstone. And I would imagine that it's probably going to be a centrally located park, and maybe the first phase probably won't have access to that park area as they master plan it, which could be problematic. It might be prudent to allow some flexibility in that for master planned or phased.
I think the idea was that if the city could get that that lot earlier in the process, it allows the Parks Department to plan for it and stage that. Plus, with getting some access easements, you could still get access to that area. And if plans change, you could always do a boundary line adjustment to adjust the plan. So it's not like hard and fast, but it's just to secure that for that development.
It just becomes problematic from a land development standpoint, because typically the landowner, well, if raw ground is not the same as the developer, and there's a takedown schedule and ownership is different, and if there's no development happening, then, for instance, if it's a farm field, then they're going to want to keep farming it. And if it's owned by the city, there's just complications there. And also, the one thing I do know for sure is that development plans change. I don't think I've ever seen one large PUD that has ever stayed exactly the same as when it was first submitted. So that is, I guess I understand it's a great idea. I just think we need to look at that part from just a practical standpoint from the other side. Because I know the Parks Department's going to want to plan for it, but I don't know if them having the actual dirt deeded to them is going to prohibit them from planning.
In like your farming example, we currently have city of Post Falls owned property that people lease and they farm currently. So if for some reason that was a situation, there's nothing to said that, you know, the city receives that property, that we don't just have another agreement that allows something to occur there in the interim.
Yeah, I guess kind of probably the more prudent point was that typically the land developer takes down a chunk of the land at a time. And many times phase 3 is several years out. And if the park is in phase 3, they don't have the opportunity, they don't have that property. It's owned by the farmer or whoever it is. And so it just becomes problematic. And so maybe looking at that would be a smart thing to at least allow some flexibility there.
I thought I read somewhere that in order to apply for a PUD, you had to own the property. I mean, you can apply for a PUD on blue sky. I mean, like, we're maybe going to do it later. Is that what you're saying? I mean,
You have to,
No,
You
no,
can't-
they're contract buyers typically. So
you have to have, typically it's under contract. You have to have the
right,
permission of
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Okay, all
you
right. So
typically
there
have to
has to
have-
be some
yeah.
kind of ownership. I mean, you can't just say, well, we think we're going to go there. And so I get your point, but I think that the bigger point behind it is if they don't have all their ducks in a row, they shouldn't be coming to the city for a PUD to begin with. I mean, it's a waste of everybody's time.
Sure, and typically, most developers, all the ones that I work with that do big greenfield developments, they have everything. It's just typically their contracts have a schedule of when they have to make payments and control the debt, and that just makes things, dedicating a park that is, and this is only like for a big greenfield development. There's probably 5 of those that will probably happen in the future here in Post Falls, 5 or 10. All right, maybe 15. There's a lot. There's a lot of areas in Post Falls, but still, it's dedicating a park with the first phase. I don't know. It just might be more of a pain in the butt for the city. I mean, it's probably doable for all parties involved. It just may make some developers shy away from doing a PUD and just go with a straight subdivision.
So I've made a note of that. We'll revisit it. Your points are well taken. It's frankly repeating some of the conversations we've all had about this. It's sort of a balancing act. You have a desire to make sure that you're getting those dedications early. Number one, to make sure it happens before the developer. If we have another downturn in the economy, you have a development founder also getting it into the hopper so you can start planning for it, versus trying to make sure that the process is convenient and easy to get through, and also recognizing that it's going to increase the upfront cost, because now you're going to have to take down that piece in addition to your first phase up front, so you're front loading some of the expenses. So we recognize that, and it's something we've kicked around. I don't know that this was sort of where we landed, but we'll go back and kick that around and go from there, I guess.
And I guess the other thing with regards to the 10% is that in the past, at least in some developments like Fieldstone, we always tried to keep a running total. So first phase had 10%, then the running total of what was ever developed had at least 10%. And there were times where you were up at 15%, and so the next phase didn't have any open space, but still the total was at least 10% or more. And I thought that was a great way to keep developers honest. Mm-hmm. And to keep them, especially if there's a downturn in the economy, which will happen. If they're sitting there at 8% or 5% and everything just turns belly up and they walk away from the property, then we're left with a PUD that doesn't necessarily meet the requirements of the
Yeah, and
10%.
that's sort of where we're trying to get to with the requirement that each phase can stand on its own. We didn't want to speak to parks specifically or call it a percentage, just because every given development, it's going to look a little bit different, and you may have one that's all of the open space is one big central park, and it's really hard in that instance to say you should have had that 10% with each phase. So I think we can identify and address those as we get applications with a condition and say, okay, by this phase, you should be hopefully developing some open space. Or if it is going to be one big central park, let's set up the phasing plan such that that's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Okay.
All right, where do we go? We go next. So we got all of those. So another big change, this is a bit of a different approach in Post Falls. Currently under our code, and you just lived it last month, our PUD process allows for an applicant to come in and recommend or request densities and uses that aren't typically allowed in the underlying zone. It creates some really interesting issues for staff, because now you're trying to track what's allowed and what's not allowed. And at some point, some of the issues we've had is you have some single-family residential developments that have been developed as a PUD in industrial areas. So if somebody wants to come in and build a paint booth to paint automobiles in his garage, is it allowed? I don't know. I mean, probably, which you may or may not want to allow in a residential neighborhood. Also, you get sort of what we've just recently lived with, having densities that are really outside of what the code would otherwise allow. So what we've tried to do is say, essentially, for uses, you can ask for any use that's allowed by right in the zoning code or by special use permit. So you can come in and say, we want to have those types of uses in our PUD. If you want to have uses that are not on those two lists, you need to have a zone change and change that portion of your development to an appropriate zone. That application is run concurrently with the PUD application, so there's just essentially still one hearing process, but you've gone through the process of making the zoning map match up on some level with what the uses are, so that people know what they're getting. That's where you get that certainty again. People understand what they've got. As far as densities, what we've done is essentially said we measure the density of your site. What's your gross area times what the density is that's allowed. That's your starting number. In other words, you're not going to get punished for the open space. So you back out 10% of your site for open space, you still can have that level of extra density in your home. So there's essentially a cap at 10%. And then we've built in an allowance for, if you're going to provide additional open space, you have the ability to get another small bump in density in your development. But that would be what you could get. That would be the limit. We're going to double check that number with our consultants who are working on our zoning code, because they're building some of that into our some subdivision suggestions. We want to make sure that we're not undercutting what they're doing. But our proposal was to allow for a 10% increase for an additional 5% of open space. But that's a number that we want to have them run some calculations on and make sure that it makes sense and doesn't, like I say, undercut what they're working on.
So currently our R1 zone allows, 5 units per acre? So if they did a PUD with 15% open space, they could do 5.5? Yeah,
essentially. So you'd take the 5, you'd get 10%, so 5.5.
Yeah, okay.
So it gives you a little bit of a bonus for doing additional open space in a development, and that's pretty much what you get. If you want more density than that, again, you go through the zone change process.
Right.
And so that's kind of it. The rest of it was process changes that we intended to get to you next month. I can give you a sneak preview to what that's looking like. Again, sort of what we've been living is the process as it currently functions has some bugs in the process, where the planning commission holds a public hearing and then it goes to the city council as a new business item, and they don't hold a public hearing. It can create some interesting wrinkles that I'm actually dealing with now, where you have people wanting to talk to the city council but not having a process to do that, and so they'll send things sort of directly via email. And now how do you address that? Because you don't have a process to allow for public comment at that point in the process. So we're proposing to go to a procedure where the final decision would be made by the planning commission. So what happens here, that's the final decision of the city, unless it's appealed. If it's appealed, the city council would then hold a new hearing at that point, and so you'd allow those folks to come in and have their say before the city council and avoid some of the process, the things that we're saying now with sort of end runs around and trying to wrestle with some of that. And I don't fault people for that. This is a very weird process. Quasi judicial it's not it's not normal.
But
It's a
fun.
legal process, which by definition isn't normal.
Would there be a fee for an appeal?
Yes.
So they'd have to come in, if someone were to appeal a decision, they'd have to come in and
Yeah,
fill out an
I
application.
don't know what
There'd
our
be a-
appeal fee is in our code, but it's I would guess a couple $100. I don't know. We have, the code allows for it now. The oddity is, how do you have an appeal from a city council decision?
Sure.
So it kind of doesn't, right now it never happens. It's never
court.
done, but it's allowed for. So that would be some of the procedural stuff that we'll dive into next month.
Interesting.
Any further questions, comments, things you'd like to see that you don't see, things that you see that you don't like?
I feel like I'm talking too much. But one thing we allow now in our PUD ordinance is private streets. And I live on one, and they're a great idea and I've designed several in Bells Falls, and they're a great idea to start with. But 30 years down the road, especially in starter home neighborhoods, they don't get maintained the way they should.
Snow
And
removal maintenance.
well, snow removal's fine, but it's just the long-term maintenance because everything has got a lifespan. And generally speaking, most private neighborhoods that have small neighborhoods have private streets. If they're starter home neighborhoods, they don't have people in charge with the knowledge to have a long-term maintenance plan for replacement. That's very problematic because when the roads start to fall apart 30 years down the road, either property values fall or they don't rise as fast as neighboring neighborhoods, and it creates a blighted neighborhood, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And I think from a long-term perspective that maybe we should not allow private streets, that we may allow changes to, or allow deviations from the street standard, but maintain public ownership of those streets. We don't allow public ownership or private ownership of the water sewer systems.
So how would you suggest that a private gated community be handled? There's 55 and older in Post Falls. There's a few of those. There's Harborview or whatever it is when you go in the gates down there. So how would you propose that? I mean, if they're gated, then they should be open to all citizens, right? I mean,
Yeah, if it's public street,
okay,
yeah.
so you can't have gated then. You couldn't have gated in private streets unless I'm
Yeah, generally, and this is a conversation, again, that staff, we kicked around a couple different ways. I've made a note to go back and take a look at it. So that, your comment is sort of one of the things that, one of our considerations is there is a market, there's a place probably for gated subdivisions. I'm not a personal fan of them. I don't really particularly like them. I don't particularly like private streets. I think, and Bill and company have done a pretty good job of addressing our street standards, essentially allowing for narrower, can't speak tonight, cross sections, trying to help create an incentive to make more streets public rather than private, to give some more flexibility. What we've tried to do is set it up to where you could have essentially some security built in. I was looking through our findings. I thought I had in here a finding that will essentially allow for conditions to address some of that. I want to go back through and make sure that our findings say what I think they did. I'm not saying it quickly, scrolling through it, but I think the idea was to try to allow for, if somebody comes in and wants a gated subdivision, that we have a hook essentially to say, okay, what's your mechanism to make sure that there's adequate maintenance going forward? What does that look like? How are you going to do this?
Okay.
Well, I don't think a lot of people want them anyhow, but they're definitely there, and I think that there is kind of a niche for them.
Yep,
And
I didn't think about
they shouldn't be
that.
excluded for,
I know that over in Coeur d'Alene, Greenstone is, I think, building their third or fourth phase of them in Coeur d'Alene Place. There is a market for them, and you know, the Snowbird folks, they sell really well.
Yeah.
And maybe you should accommodate, maybe you shouldn't. That's above my pay grade to make that decision.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments? No. Okay. It's a public hearing, but we don't need to vote on anything, do we?
No, we've got your comments, so we can take a look at those, and we can give you some more thoughts on those when we come back next month to talk about procedure stuff.
Okay.
So the one motion, I suppose, would be to continue the public hearing until, what's the date of the next hearing?
December 12th
No, November.
or November?
Let me find this for you.
Skip November.
We're going to skip November.
A month on.
November 14th at 6 PM.
Okay. So we need to entertain a motion?
I'd move to continue this public hearing till November 14th at 6 PM at our next regularly scheduled planning commission meeting.
I second it.
Okay.
Call for
Keith?
vote?
Yes.
Carey,
Yes.
Kimball,
Yes.
Davis.
Yes.
Hampe.
yes.
All right. Thank you, staff, for all the hard work, which brings us to new business, 2016 fee schedule.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tavis Schmidt, Associate Planner with the City of Post Falls. I'm just going to be kind of going an overview of the Development Impact Fee Report from fiscal year 2016. This paper here is in the packet, in your Council or Commissioner packet here. The State of Idaho requires annual reviews of the development impact fees. And so this, I'm just going to go over it really quickly here and entertain any questions that you would have. So this is for fiscal year 2016, which is from October 1st of 2015 to September 30th of 2016. We collect impact fees for roads or streets, parks, and public safety. And so the 3 bullet points we have down here, for the roads, there was a little over $1 million was spent in fiscal year 2016 on roads. The project for those were for Southeast congestion to alleviate and mitigate Southeast congestion. The 7th Avenue design project, that project was recently completed. And then Spencer Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. And then the realignment of 15th, 16th Avenue just on the east side of Idaho. There. Regarding parks, Parks spent a little over $38,000 for the skate park there. There was the speed ring that actually I've been on. It's quite fun. And then public safety. The police department did some facility upgrades and maintenance, and then some other things regarding 911 services, and they spent a little over $270,000 for that. So if there's any questions of that, I have some more detailed reports in here for that.
Any questions?
No.
No. Okay, so there's just be a motion from the Planning and Zoning Commission to pass this on to City Council as a new business.
Okay.
So we're just looking at what was spent, that's all. I mean,
Yeah.
we're just, okay.
It's just,
Turn it over to
the
City Council.
Planning and Zoning Commission, you act as the Development Impact Review Committee also, and so this has to be brought to you as your kind of dual roles in that.
What does the city council then do on it?
They Not much.
Hey, listen.
It's an
Stay safe.
interesting
Sounds good.
provision. State code requires that
Just present it.
periodically that the Impact Fee Advisory Committee makes this report to City Council, and it's supposed to be annual. I don't know how many cities actually do it because there's really nothing to do with it once it's done. So it's complying with code. We make a report to City Council as to what's the status of the impact fees are, and which finance should know anyways. I mean, this is all stuff that
Right.
happens on the finance side all the time anyways. So this is your report to City Council as to what's happened with the fees.
Can I ask a question that, I mean, I think it's probably all perfect how you spent it. But as I looked through all of these, it seems like we're taking in a lot more than we're spending, right? I
Yes.
mean, as I look through these reports. So is there a plan for those monies that are sitting there? Or are we anticipating that maybe those impact fees are a little high? Or, I mean, it's obviously it's not a balance.
Yes.
not-
So, there's the kind of the cycle of things. So the impact fees are taken in to accommodate smaller projects like the skate park, or larger projects if we need like new signals at intersections or widening like that. So yes, there are more monies have been taken in, and then what that's going to do is it slowly build up until there's enough funds then to undertake a larger project.
Okay.
A large park development, for instance.
Gotcha.
Another large roundabout or some.
And I know we had some roads, talk about improving roads in the next so many years, and so
Yeah.
Obviously, we're going to need a lot of money for that, so. Okay, that was just my question.
Those are based on
Thank you
capital,
for that.
or capital
Yeah,
improvement
I
plans.
was going to say, so when you set the fees, the first thing you do is you go out and say, what do we need to accomplish to service the growth? You can't look at your existing deficiencies. You just say, we're going to have growth. The growth is going to cause these problems. And you come up with a project list for, these are the things that we need to do to keep up with the growth. Then you assign a cost to it, and then you divide that out over the development you expect to give you a fee, and then you collect those fees. And you typically have to collect them for some time to have enough in the kitty to actually do some of the bigger projects. We have a certain amount of time that we have to spend those funds, and so we keep an eye on that and make sure that,
It's kind of like a reserve or something, or,
yeah, so they
Reserve
come in
account,
and you
okay.
spend them on a first in, first out basis, and so you ultimately expend them in the amount of time that you have allotted
and then
to
if you
hold them.
get too much, then you're kind of, you
Yeah, and
got to
we-
kind of, okay.
It's becoming time for us to reevaluate the impact fees again, and so then you sit back and you reevaluate, make sure what have we gotten done, what needs to be done still, and recalculate the fees based on what you need to keep up with growth at that point.
Okay, and I thought that was it. I just kind of wanted to, I was looking at those, it looked like we were actually doing a really good job, not spending all the money.
Yeah, and as an additional note, once we wrap the transportation master plan, we'll be looking at the impact fee and relooking at it and resetting everything and looking at the most recent parks master plan, the transportation master plan, and seeing where we're currently at.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, since we're an impact fee committee, is that impact fee review committee? That's another one of our titles. Any one of the committee members like to make a motion?
I'm not sure how to do it. I move that we pass on the impact fee budget to the city council for their review.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Vote.
Hampe,
Yes.
Davis,
Yes.
Kimball,
Yes.
Carey,
Yes.
Keene.
Yes.
Tavis, thank you, sir. All right, that finishes up new business, so that leads us to staff comments. Any staff comments this evening?
No, there's not.
No staff comments. Any commission comments? Anything for the good of the order?
No.
Nope. All right, well, that being said, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.